I grew up in war, not out of necessity, but out of my own family's choice. On September 10th, 1997, we moved from the Kenyan capital, Nairobi, where my siblings and I were all born and raised, to Mogadishu, Somalia. I remember that day because it was 4 days before my 9th birthday, which I anticipated would be spent with friends, family members, and neighbors. But my parents had other ideas. In just under 2 hours, on a rickety plane from Nairobi to Mogadishu, we landed at an abandoned Cold War-era military base. The runway was dilapidated. The bushes around were thick. The atmosphere inside the cabin immediately turned chaotic. Everybody was on their feet, frantically scrambling around for their carry-on luggage. Once we were outside, the scorching sun blasting against the sandy topography blinded me. And then I saw the weapons. The machine guns mounted on top of cars, the AK-47s slung over the shoulders, the pistols held tight by the belts. If there was any illusion that we were so far from home, from Nairobi, it was over then. I immediately missed Nairobi. I remembered the bookshelves that housed my storybooks. I missed my schoolmates, my wonderful school. I wanted to go back immediately to the expansive villa where my siblings and I used to chase each other endlessly, to the avocado tree that we constantly climbed and shook against our own mother's wish. All that was behind us now. Mogadishu was home. See, at the time, Mogadishu was a capital captive to war. It was a ruined city full of shrapnel-hit facades, like this one. A so-called green line divided the city between the northern part and a southern part. Ghost towns ruled in between. Once grand hotels stood empty, government offices all vacant. There were no good schools or healthcare facilities to think about. You couldn't go to the beautiful beach, or you could, but only if you had security. There were no parks to speak of. And so entertaining the idea of going outside to play soccer with your friends meant a matter of life and death. Danger lurked everywhere. And so very quickly, we settled into this routine life. We would wake up, go to school, and then come back home. We didn't have any extracurricular activities. Inertia, in many ways, became the story of our lives. But one weekend, it was a Friday, my mother said she was going to take us to a photo studio. Up until then, a lot of our family photos were taken at home, like this one, in our living room or in various spots across the city, across the house. But we were now going to take what would be our first professional photos in an actual studio. The studio was located at the Kilometer 4 junction. It was one of the major busy roadways in the city. It was specifically located inside a hotel called Sahafi Hotel. Sahafi means journalist in Arabic. And going there, we used to always encounter journalists, foreign correspondents, businessmen, politicians, aid workers hanging out at the hotel. As a kid, I was getting very curious about Mogadishu. I was getting curious about the war, about how it impacted people. I started asking my mother a lot of questions about that, and with her encouragement, started journaling. So when we used to go to Sahafi Hotel for lunch sometimes, we used to encounter all these foreign reporters with like big cameras. And I used to one day think that I would be one like them, explaining and documenting the challenges and the problems of the world. It was in the confines of the Sahafi Hotel that I learned and formed my first aspirations to become a journalist. But it was inside that hotel and the studio that was there that I also learned about the immensity of the world outside the unruly streets of Mogadishu, the possibilities that were out there. That Friday afternoon, when we walked into Sahafi's studio, I was immediately struck by the order that pervaded it. I was struck by the light modifiers, the stands, the flashes. I was in awe of the young photographers who manned the establishment. And once we had paid and were ushered past the reception, we walked into the most colorful room I had ever seen. The studio backdrops were really dreamy. Some had the drawings of an aquarium full with flowing fish, like this one. Others showed developed cities, complete with skyscrapers and intricate highways. Some of them depicted abstract art, right, with various forms and shapes and colors. And what immediately became clear to me is that inside these studios, you were free, you were protected, you were shielded from the violence and uncertainty that ruled the streets of Mogadishu. See, Mogadishu was a city where you didn't want to draw attention to yourself, lest you attract a lot of danger. So what would happen is that women like my mother could come into the studio and wear their gold. You could carry the nice handbag that you kept under the bed all the time. You could apply all the makeup you wanted. You could tuck in your shirt, which is a small, unnecessary detail in so many places across the world, but meant a matter of life and death in Mogadishu. You could wear your best shoes. These were small things that you wouldn't naturally do outside in Mogadishu. But in the photo studio, you could do that. You are allowed to imagine, you are allowed to live, you are allowed to perform. And so every time I left the studio, I was blissed out. Many of our family photos, complete with, as you can see, baggy trousers and oversized shirts, were taken at Sahafi's studio. The studio also had a garden outside, which we took so many photos over the years. The process of preparing for these shoots, the changing of the backdrops, the air of openness, the jollity around those photographers, it proved way more exciting for us to just stay at home every other weekend. So pretty soon, we started going there regularly. The studio, for me, created an everlasting keepsake. Here, away from a warring city, we were having a happy time. We were creating good times. And so by repeatedly going back with our uncle and aunt, with relatives who were visiting, or cousins who were leaving, we were creating memories of delight despite everything. We were freezing time. We were hoping, we were striving, we were building in a city and a country determined not to look into the future. When one talks about Mogadishu, you often hear of labels like the most dangerous city in the world. That's only fair, given the brutality of the Somali civil war and how long it's lasted. And when there are ample stories about death and destruction, there is a tendency within fields like my own in journalism and others to not talk about defiance and the amusing diversions that people do in these ravaged cities. Yet people do stay resilient in these tough circumstances. They adapt and create moments of happiness. Sahafi's studio and all the other studios that sprung across the city over the years were, for me, an emblem of the spirit of defiance. They created a source of strength and hope. Going to these studios was also a form of resistance against despair, one that I saw and stared at when we walked off that plane in 1997. I love this photo of me and my brother. It reminds me of my childhood and all the things that I treasured and all the things that we lost. It reminds me a lot of Mogadishu, too, which is where it was taken. There's so much progress and hope that's happening in the beautiful seaside city, but there's a lot to despair about that is still happening, including terrorist attacks. But every time I encounter these trying moments and I see these dangerous situations in Mogadishu, I think about how the city was way more dangerous in the 1990s. I think about how when the warlords were creating all this destruction, some of us were creating and enabling spaces of joy and happiness. When I go back to Mogadishu these days to report, and I pass by Kilometer 4 junction, I think of Sahafi Studio and their analog printing processes. I think of how it was not just a sacred space, but a safe haven for so many families to create everlasting memories like this one of me and my brother. I think of Sahafi Studio and believe in our own immense power as human beings to establish spaces of joy and happiness even in war. Thank you.